However, although cultural forms have a high social valuation, they are not always commercially viable. It is primarily for this reason that the state does not leave matters of culture to the vagaries of market forces, but rather intervenes in the face of market failure. And once again, we see that this is not our case. This doesn't happen here. The view of culture as a superior civilizing good linked to art and far removed from the mundane and functional has led to the opposition of the economic and the aesthetic, and the consequent rejection of mass production with relation to culture, which is said to lead to the commodification of culture. As far as this view is concerned, the words culture and industry are contradictory, that they don't go together. This view therefore defines culture as a realm separate from and often actively opposed to the realm of material production and economic activity. With such an approach, policy mainly takes the form of subsidies to cultural activities which do not reach large enough audiences to be commercially viable, and the commercial part of the cultural industry is largely ignored. This leads to a sharp demarcation between publicly supported art forms and popular art and cultural forms of a primarily commercial bent. In this regard, it is quite telling that the thing at the federal level in Nigeria is lodged with the Ministry of Information and not the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, which is something truly that is a bit odd. And then you find that it's easier for the government to fund a cultural troupe that is going to dance in some other country, and it's not so easy to find them to fund a young fellow who wants to make a film. These are things that point very much to the stance of the government here. Cultural policy, thus, is largely dictated by whether policymakers see culture as belonging to a separate realm beyond that of economic activity, or whether they see it as an economic activity that forms part of material production. Such views are necessarily colored by the link between culture and identity, be it at the national or the more localized levels. The accepted definition of culture and its role will determine the scale of the state's involvement in the sector, and this could range from one extreme of no state involvement whatsoever to the other extreme of the state's control of cultural resources. It is therefore not surprising that it has been observed that the creation and management of such policy is one of the most complex areas of modern government, a kind of balancing act, not so much between competing priorities, as in other areas of policy, but between competing visions of the role of culture in society. As it often happens, however, the challenge for the policymaker is to know when to intervene. States, as already indicated, do not leave culture wholly to market forces, but often step in when the market is defective. The question is to identify both the right moment and the required intervention. This is not always a straightforward process, given that much cultural activity, both production and consumption, is carried out in the private sector. If the role of government is to create a context in which markets work fairly and efficiently, and intervene where they do not, the focus for policy must be to understand where a market is defective and to assess what action should be taken. Oftentimes, the decisive action of the state in this regard is necessary. As pointed out by the United Nations Creative Economy Report, the market, contrary to conventional wisdom, does not have a near miraculous capacity to address socio-economic imbalances. Thus, policies and actions to foster development should be rooted in a balanced role for policy interventions and the market. Such policy interventions of the state will often be captured in regulations, for, after all, the most tangible power available to states is lawmaking. And this is the most important role which the state plays. But adopting policies and enacting the consequent laws are one thing. Applying those regulations and achieving the desired results are quite another thing altogether. In this regard, the state has its limitations, which it perforce must recognize. According to a couple of authors, the age of the command economy has passed. Governments across the continent increasingly recognize the limits to their ability to make things happen. The complexity of contemporary society and the interdependency of local and national economies mean that governments must influence rather than direct change. They must work with and through a vast range of public, private, and independent sector partners. Nowhere is this more true than in the fluid, changeable world of culture, where the state's efforts in one direction will often produce unexpected, perhaps unwanted, results elsewhere. In the cultural sector, individual vision can have a huge and unforeseen impact, where substantial public resources can appear to produce no change at all. So that there's a need for the state, before it passes any policy, to discuss with those in the sector, and many times that really doesn't happen. Given the dominant role of the private market sector in the production and dissemination of cultural notions and artifacts, the state needs to work closely with this sector. A policy which has been developed in partnership with the sector on which its implementation depends obviously has a better chance of being successful in practice, since it will reflect the experience and the concerns of people working in all sectors. The failure of the state to engage with that sector will mean that it will neither understand the culture of our time or the challenges and opportunities which that dominant culture offers to public policy makers. A large part of the inaction of the government with regard to the Nigerian film industry is what could be considered as a prevalent bias, which considers filmmaking as something unserious. As Amaka Igwe once said to me, that they consider their work as play. They are merely play, not something serious. Okay? And this is as a result of us having understood the potential of that sector. As already indicated, it is sometimes a challenge for the state to know when to intervene and how far such intervention should go. In this regard, an adequate guiding principle will be that of subsidiarity. According to this principle, it is the obligation of the government to limit its intervention into lower forms of social organization and to do only that which the lesser group cannot accomplish for itself without assistance. Well, without going into all the technicalities of the discussion of this principle, suffice it to say that it is a principle that both limits the actuation of the state or any higher power, while empowering it to swing into action in the face of a lack which the lower body cannot satisfy for itself. It is a model of fulfillment through relationship and assistance to all levels of social interaction. The added importance of this principle, especially with regard to governing the cultural sector, is the fundamental role that it gives to the notion of freedom. The principle presupposes that human flourishing requires freedom. An individual must be free to realize her own destiny through her own initiative, her own response to the circumstances that her life presents to her in concrete historical choices. That was according to an author. These are important notions in the considerations of a sector that thrives on creativity, which in turn rests to a large extent on freedom. Accordingly, as stated by Galloway and Dunlop, the crucial question common to the entire cultural sector is democracy and freedom of expression. The role of cultural policy is to ensure this, creating the space for different types of cultural expression, including local, regional, and national cultural identities. Thus, there are many considerations that should come into play in the definition of cultural policy. The policy of many states is now oriented towards the development of the cultural industry. Although there continues to be varied views on the notion of the cultural industries, it is generally accepted today that these are industries that combine the cultural and the economic in the creation of cultural goods and services. This acceptance on the part of the policymakers was largely facilitated by the recognition of the economic significance of the market-driven cultural industries and the fact that most people's cultural needs and aspirations are being, for better or worse, supplied by the market as goods and services. In conclusion, it is true that the changed outlook of the Nigerian government towards the film industry was motivated by the recognition of the video film industry's economic viability in terms of promoting wealth and jobs. However, the government's policy change lacks the added and necessary accompaniment of structural investment in the industry and in the creative workers. The workers lack training and are often exposed to exploitation. Thus, Nigerian state policy for the development of the creative industries still needs to be adequately developed. It therefore devolves on the industry to encourage the government to be more supportive, so that because some pressure has to be brought to bear on the government in this regard, and this can be done on the one hand through lobbying, but on the other hand, and more relevant to the government's desire to exploit the creative industries, there's a need to make the state, the government, appreciate the importance of the sector. Towards this end, there's a need for information, there's a need for data, the collation of data. And this is where, if I may say so, the importance of a center such as this comes in. Because formal work needs to be done for people to see that, well, we're not just talking about a few fellows having fun, doing nothing. No, it's serious business. There's serious business going on. A lot of income is being generated. A lot of people are living on this, and they're making a great contribution to the economy. Regardless of the level of involvement in the film industry of other countries, their interventions usually indicate a greater commitment towards the development of the film industries than is to be found in the Nigerian situation. The government has created a fund for the entertainment industry at large, but it might be useful for you to consider other forms of interventions, especially in the line of promoting infrastructural growth, enforceable regulation, subsidies, and advantages that give preferential treatment to the industry. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope I have not given you a headache.